My name is Mark Bishop. I am 44 years old. For 15 years, I was a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army, most of that time with the 75th Ranger Regiment. When I got out, I took the discipline and the attention to detail they taught me, and I started a small logistics company. It did well. But my real life, the thing I lived for, happened on the weekends. It happened in the woods. I was a hunter, a tracker, a fisherman. I was more at home under a canopy of pine trees than I ever was under a roof. I believed I understood the wilderness. I believed I knew its rules, its rhythms, and its dangers. I was wrong. I'm telling this story because the official report is a lie, and the men who died deserve more than a convenient fiction written on a law enforcement form. And maybe, just maybe, someone else will hear this and not make the same mistakes we did. The trip was an annual tradition. The second week of November, deer season in Louisiana.
For the last 6 years, my best friend, Cal Robertson, and I had a lease on 160 acres of dense woodland bordering the Kisatchie National Forest. It was remote. You took a state highway to a parish road, to a gravel road, and finally to a muddy, rutted track that was barely passable after a hard rain. At the end of that track was our cabin. It wasn't much, just a single large room with a pot-bellied stove, 4 bunks, a small kitchen counter with a propane stove, and a chemical toilet in a closet-sized room. No electricity, no running water. We had a generator for a few lights and to charge our phones, but we rarely used it. The whole point was to get away from all that. This time was different. Cal had invited his younger cousin, Brian, and Brian's new girlfriend, Alyssa. I wasn't thrilled. Our hunting trip was a quiet, almost sacred thing for Cal and me. We understood each other without having to talk much. We moved through the woods with a shared purpose, honed by years of friendship and our similar backgrounds in the service. Cal had been a Marine. Adding 2 more people, especially one who was a complete novice, felt like an intrusion. Brian was in his late 20s, cocky in that way people are when they've never been truly tested. He worked in finance and viewed the outdoors as a rustic backdrop for a good time. Alyssa was a city girl, sweet but clearly out of her element. She looked at the towering longleaf pines and the dense, swampy undergrowth with a wide-eyed apprehension that I found both endearing and concerning. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of pine needles and wet earth. Cal and I fell into our usual routine. We unloaded the gear from my truck, coolers of food, rifles, packs, cases of water. Brian tried to help, but mostly got in the way, treating his brand new, top-of-the-line rifle like it was a fragile toy. Alyssa stayed near the truck, pulling her jacket tight and swatting at invisible insects. I tried to be welcoming. I showed Brian the best place to sight in his rifle, a small clearing we'd made a few hundred yards from the cabin. I pointed out the different types of trees to Alyssa and explained how the ecosystem worked. She listened politely, but her eyes kept darting toward the dark tree line. She was already spooked. Cal shot me a look while Brian was fumbling with his scope. It was an apologetic glance. He mouthed the words, "I know." I just nodded. It was his family. We'd make the best of it. We spent the rest of the afternoon getting the cabin in order, unpacking food, and laying out our gear for the morning hunt. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, I fired up the generator. The sudden roar shattered the evening quiet, and a few bare bulbs flickered to life inside the cabin, casting a warm, yellow glow. Cal got a fire going in the outdoor fire pit, and soon we were sitting around it in camp chairs, drinking beer while steaks sizzled on the grill. For a little while, it felt normal. Brian told loud, obnoxious stories about his office politics, and Alyssa laughed at the right moments, though she still seemed tense. Cal and I talked about our plans for the morning, where we'd set up our stands, which trails the deer were likely using. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the darkening sky. The familiar sounds of the woods at dusk started up, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. It was the last time I would feel peace in those woods. The first wrong thing was the silence. It crept in so slowly I didn't notice it at first. It was only after Brian had exhausted his supply of stories and a comfortable lull fell over our group that it registered. The crickets had stopped. The owl was no longer hooting.
The entire forest, which should have been humming with a low-grade thrum of nocturnal life, had gone completely, utterly quiet. It was a dead silence, heavy and unnatural. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. I sat up a little straighter in my chair, straining my ears. Nothing. Not a leaf rustle, not a snapped twig. Just the hiss and pop of our fire. I looked over at Cal. He was staring out into the impenetrable darkness beyond the ring of firelight, his beer forgotten in his hand. His face, illuminated by the flickering flames, was a mask of concentration. He felt it too. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice low. "You mean, hear nothing?" he replied, not taking his eyes off the trees. Brian scoffed. "Hear what? It's the woods, man. It gets quiet." He took a long swallow of his beer, trying to project an air of nonchalant expertise. "Probably a big predator moving through, a bobcat or something, spooks all the little critters." I didn't answer him.
A bobcat didn't create a silence this profound, this absolute. This felt different. This felt wrong. The air grew colder, and the small hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was a primal feeling, an instinct honed not just in the woods, but in the dusty streets of Fallujah and the mountain passes of Afghanistan. It was the feeling of being watched by something that meant you harm. Alyssa must have felt it too, because she had moved her chair closer to Brian's and was looking around nervously, her face pale. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Cal stood up. "I'm going to grab another log for the fire," he said, his voice a little too loud. He walked over to the woodpile near the edge of the clearing, his hand casually resting on the butt of the large pistol he always wore on his hip when we were out here. He was being cautious, and that made me even more uneasy. As he bent down to pick up a split log, a sound shattered the stillness. It was a single, sharp crack, like a heavy branch snapping. It came from deep in the woods, maybe 100 yards out, in the direction of the creek. We all froze. Brian even lowered his beer. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a coyote. I've heard both many times. This was deeper, more resonant, and it carried a chilling note of intelligent malevolence. It was a sound that didn't belong in any forest I had ever been in. It vibrated in my chest, a bass note of pure menace. Then, just as suddenly as it started, there was silence again. Alyssa let out a small, terrified gasp. "What was that?" she whispered. "Probably just a boar," Brian said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "They get big out here. Nasty tempers." He was trying to rationalize it, for her sake and for his own. But a wild hog doesn't growl like that, and it doesn't make the woods fall silent in terrified anticipation. Cal walked back to the fire and tossed the log on, sending a shower of sparks into the air. He didn't sit down. He stood with his back to the flames, facing the darkness. "Mark," he said, his voice tight. "Let's call it a night. Get everything locked up." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. I stood up immediately. "Good call." I started gathering the trash, putting the leftover food into the secure cooler we kept in the bed of the truck. Brian grumbled about us being paranoid,
But he didn't argue. Even he couldn't deny the oppressive wrongness that had descended upon our camp. We worked quickly and efficiently, moving with a shared sense of urgency. We doused the fire, plunging the campsite into near total darkness, broken only by the faint starlight filtering through the pines. The generator was still running, so the cabin was a lone beacon of light in a sea of black. As I was locking the lid on the cooler, I heard another sound. Scraping.
A rhythmic, deliberate scraping sound coming from the side of the cabin, the side that faced away from the clearing and toward the dense woods. It sounded like thick claws being dragged down the rough-hewn wooden planks. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. My blood ran cold. "Cal," I hissed. "Did you hear that?" He was beside me in an instant, his pistol now in his hand. "Heard it," he whispered back. "Get them inside, now." I didn't have to be told twice. I grabbed a hesitant Alyssa by the arm and practically pulled her toward the cabin steps. "Inside, now, move." Brian, finally looking scared, followed close behind. Cal backed toward the door, his pistol aimed at the dark corner of the cabin where the sound had come from. We scrambled inside, and I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, throwing the thick deadbolt. The sound was loud and final in the small space. Cal immediately went to the window next to the door, peering through a small gap in the curtains. "I don't see anything," he said, his breath fogging the cold glass. "Whatever it was, it's gone." "What do you mean, whatever it was?" Brian demanded, his voice trembling slightly. "It was a bear, right? Trying to get at the food." "A bear doesn't scrape a wall like that, Brian," I said, my patience worn thin. "That was deliberate." I walked over to the wall where we'd heard the sound. I ran my hand over the interior planks, listening. Silence. Outside, the generator continued its steady drone, a comforting mechanical noise in the face of the unnerving quiet of the forest. Alyssa was sitting on one of the bunks, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth. She was crying silently. I felt a pang of guilt. This was supposed to be a fun trip for her, an adventure. Now she was terrified, and I couldn't honestly tell her she had nothing to be afraid of. Because I was afraid too. Cal and I were both combat veterans. We had faced men with guns who were trying to kill us. We had been in situations where survival was measured in seconds. But this was different. This was an unknown, an ancient fear of the dark, and what lurks within it. We spent the next hour in a state of high alert. Cal and I took turns watching the windows, our rifles now leaning against the wall next to us. Brian tried to make a few jokes, but they fell flat. He eventually lapsed into a sullen silence, occasionally glancing at Alyssa, who hadn't moved. The only sounds were the hum of the generator and Alyssa's quiet sobs. Around midnight, just as I was starting to think that maybe the creature had moved on, we heard a new sound. It was coming from the front porch. A soft, inquisitive sniffing. A wet, heavy sound right at the crack of the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was right there. Just a few inches of wood separating us. Then came a soft thud, followed by the metallic click of the doorknob turning. My breath caught in my throat. It was testing the door. It was trying the handle. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't any animal I had ever known. Animals don't turn doorknobs. A wave of cold, rational fear washed over me. We were dealing with something intelligent, something that was thinking, problem-solving. Cal raised his rifle, the barrel pointed squarely at the center of the door. His knuckles were white where he gripped the forestock. I mirrored his action, bringing my own rifle up, the familiar weight a small comfort. Brian stared at the door, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The sniffing continued, louder now, more insistent. It was followed by a low whine, a sound of frustration. Then, a heavy weight slammed against the door, making the entire cabin shudder. Alyssa screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. The impact was followed by another and another, each one more powerful than the last. It was trying to break the door down. The heavy wood groaned and the frame trembled. I could see the wood around the deadbolt splintering. "It's coming in," Brian yelled, scrambling backward. "Get that table," Cal shouted, never taking his eyes off the door. "Barricade it." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the heavy wooden table we used for eating and dragged it across the floor, ramming it up against the door. Brian, jolted into action, helped me shove it tight. The impacts continued, shaking the whole structure. Splinters of wood flew from the door frame. I could hear it now, a furious, guttural snarling on the other side, a sound of pure, unrestrained rage. Then, as suddenly as it began, the assault on the door stopped. We stood frozen, listening. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise. The only sound was our own ragged breathing and the hum of the generator. "Is it gone?" Alyssa whispered from the bunk. "I don't know," Cal said, his voice low and strained. "Stay quiet." We waited. A minute stretched into 5, then 10. Nothing. No sound from outside except the generator. I risked a look through the curtain of the window next to the door. I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The porch was empty. "Maybe it gave up," Brian said, a hopeful tremor in his voice. "It didn't give up," I said grimly. "It's thinking. It's looking for another way in." As if on cue, we heard a scraping sound from above us, on the roof. Slow, heavy footsteps crossing the tin sheeting. My stomach dropped. It had climbed onto the roof. It was looking for a weak point. We were trapped in a flimsy wooden box with a monster on top of it. A monster that was smart. The footsteps moved to the center of the roof, right above the stovepipe for the pot-bellied stove. We heard a metallic groaning sound. "It's trying to rip the chimney out," Cal breathed, his eyes wide as he looked up at the ceiling. We were all looking up, imagining the creature just feet above us, tearing at the metal. The thought of it dropping down through the ceiling into the middle of the room was paralyzing. The generator sputtered. It coughed once, twice, and then died. The lights went out, plunging us into absolute darkness. Alyssa shrieked again. The sudden loss of our only light, combined with the sounds from the roof, was a devastating psychological blow. We were blind. "My phone!" Brian yelled, fumbling in his pockets. "I've got a light." A second later, the thin, bluish beam of a phone's flashlight cut through the darkness. He played it around the room, the light dancing manically off our terrified faces. "Keep it steady, Brian," Cal snapped. "Point it at the ceiling." Brian aimed the light upwards. The groaning from the roof stopped. We heard the heavy footsteps again, moving this time toward the back of the cabin. Then, a new sound, the sickening crack of splintering wood. It was at the back window, the small window in the bathroom. "Mark, the back!" Cal yelled. I moved instantly, grabbing my rifle. I fumbled in the dark for the bathroom door, yanked it open, and stepped inside the tiny room. The sound was louder here, a loud, repetitive cracking as something pried at the window frame. I could see the faint outline of the window against the night sky. A dark shape was blotting out the stars, a massive, broad-shouldered silhouette. Then, with a final, violent crack, the entire window frame was ripped from the wall and tossed aside. A blast of cold, damp air filled the small room. And then it leaned in. Even in the near total darkness, I could see it. It was worse than anything I could have imagined. Its head was canine, like a wolf or a monstrous German shepherd, but massive. Its eyes seemed to glow with a faint internal luminescence, a sickly yellow-green. They were not the reflective shine of an animal's eyes in the dark. They glowed with their own light. Its shoulders were immense, wider than the window frame, and covered in coarse, dark fur. It had to hunch down to even look inside. It let out a low, rumbling growl, and I was hit with a wave of its breath. It smelled like rotting meat and damp earth, a charnel house stench that made me gag. For a second I was frozen, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. This thing was impossible. It couldn't exist. It was a nightmare given form. But the smell, the cold air, the sound of its breathing, it was real. The creature reached a hand through the now empty window frame. A hand, not a paw. It was a grotesque parody of a human hand, with long, spindly fingers tipped with thick, yellowed claws that looked like railroad spikes. It groped blindly in the dark, scraping against the interior wall. That broke my paralysis. I raised my rifle, but the bathroom was so small I couldn't get a clear line of sight without backing out of the room. It was too close. I took a step back into the main cabin, my boot heel catching on the rug. I stumbled, falling backward onto the floor. My rifle clattered out of my grasp. "Mark!" Cal shouted. At that moment, Brian did the stupidest, bravest, most pointless thing I have ever seen. Maybe he thought he could scare it. Maybe he was just running on pure, panicked adrenaline. He let out a yell and charged toward the bathroom, swinging a heavy iron fire poker he'd grabbed from the hearth. "Get out of here!" he screamed. It happened so fast. The creature's head snapped toward the sound of his voice. The long, clawed hand shot out of the bathroom and seized Brian by the front of his shirt. It was impossibly fast. Brian didn't even have time to scream. The creature lifted him off his feet as if he weighed nothing and slammed him against the wall with sickening force. I heard a wet crunch and Brian went limp. Then it pulled him. It dragged him, limp and broken, toward the back window. Alyssa's screams became a continuous, high-pitched wail of horror. Cal, seeing what was happening, fired his rifle. The roar of the .30-06 in the confined space was deafening. The bullet hit the wall next to the bathroom door, showering the room with splinters. The creature didn't even flinch. It continued to pull Brian's body through the small window, a feat that should have been impossible. There was a horrible sound of tearing fabric and breaking bones. And then he was gone. We were left in the ringing silence, the smell of cordite thick in the air. Alyssa's wail subsided into hysterical, gulping sobs. Brian was gone, just like that. One moment he was there, full of misplaced bravado, and the next he was just gone, swallowed by the darkness. Cal and I looked at each other in the dim, wavering light of the phone, which had fallen to the floor and was now pointed at the ceiling. His face was ashen. The hunter, the Marine, the man who was afraid of nothing, looked utterly terrified. We both knew, in that moment, that we were not hunting. We were being hunted, and our guns, our training, our sturdy little cabin, it was all a joke. We were prey. "We have to get out of here," Cal said, his voice raspy. "We're not going to survive until morning in this box." "The truck," I said, my mind racing. "We make a run for the truck." "Mark," Cal said, his voice grim. "When I went to get the firewood, I checked the truck. The tires are slashed, all 4 of them." The blood drained from my face. My hope, which had been a tiny, flickering ember, was extinguished. It had been smart enough to disable our only means of escape before it began its assault. It had trapped us here. It had planned this. The scraping sound we heard earlier
wasn't just random intimidation. It was likely the sound of its claws tearing through the sidewalls of my tires. We had been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. We were miles from the nearest paved road.
Miles of dense, dark forest, filled with a creature that was faster, stronger, and smarter than we were. Our chances of making it out on foot were practically zero. But Cal was right. Staying in the cabin was a death sentence. It had already torn a wall. It was only a matter of time before it got in. "Okay," I said, forcing my mind to work, to think tactically. "Okay, we wait for a lull. We wait for it to get distracted and we run. We head east, toward the old logging road. It's overgrown, but it's our straightest shot out of here. Maybe 3 miles. 3 miles? Alyssa sobbed from the corner. "We can't. It will get us." "Staying here is not an option, Alyssa," I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. "We move or we die. Those are the choices." Cal put a hand on my shoulder. "Easy, Mark." He looked over at Alyssa. "He's right. It's our only chance. We'll stick together. We'll protect you." Just then, a new sound began. A rhythmic, heavy thudding against the front of the cabin. Not the furious assault from before, but something slower, more deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of something heavy being thrown against the wall. Cal and I crept to the front window, the one next to the barricaded door. He held the phone, angling the light so we could get a glimpse outside without being seen. I peered through the crack in the curtains. My stomach churned at what I saw. The creature was standing in the clearing, just at the edge of the firelight that wasn't there. It was fully visible in the pale moonlight. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was a grotesque fusion of man and wolf. It stood on 2 powerful, digitigrade legs, bent backward like a dog's, which gave it a perpetually crouched, predatory posture. Its torso was lean but powerfully muscled, tapering to a narrow waist. But its arms were what truly defied biology. They were too long for its body, hanging down almost to its knees. The shoulders were impossibly broad, and the arms were thick with corded muscle. The hands, those 5-fingered, claw-tipped abominations, were holding a large rock. As I watched, it casually tossed the rock, maybe 50 pounds, against the cabin wall. Thump. It wasn't trying to break in. It was just throwing rocks at us. It was terrorizing us, taunting us. It knew we were trapped. It knew it had all the time in the world. After a few more throws, it dropped the rock and turned its massive head, looking directly at the window where I was hiding. Its glowing yellow eyes seemed to bore right through the wood, right into my soul. It knew I was watching. It tilted its head, a curiously intelligent canine gesture. And then it opened its mouth, and a sound came out that was not a growl, not a bark, but a twisted, distorted mimicry of a human voice. It was a gurgling, horrible sound, but the words were clear. "Come out," it rasped, the sound like stones grinding together. I recoiled from the window as if I'd been burned. I stumbled back, my heart pounding with a new and profound level of terror. It could talk, or at least it could mimic speech. This creature, this monster from the depths of hell, was not just an animal. It was a thinking, speaking entity. The last vestiges of my rational, ordered world crumbled into dust. Cal grabbed me, his face a question. "What? What did you see?" "It spoke," I choked out. "Cal, it spoke!" Before he could process this, the creature let out a deafening roar of fury and charged the cabin. This time, it didn't bother with the door. It slammed its full weight into the wall right next to the window. The wood groaned, splintered, and then burst inward. A shower of planks and insulation exploded into the room. A huge, ragged hole, 3 feet wide, opened up in our fortress. A massive, furred arm reached through, claws extended, swiping blindly in the dark. We scrambled back. Cal, acting on pure instinct, shoved the barrel of his rifle into the hole and pulled the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated the creature's face, contorted in a snarl of rage, just on the other side. The bullet struck it somewhere in the shoulder or chest. It let out a piercing shriek, a sound of agony and fury that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was high-pitched and metallic, like tearing steel. The arm withdrew from the hole. We heard it crashing away from the cabin, thrashing through the undergrowth. It was hurt. Cal's shot had connected. "Now!" I yelled. "This is our chance. Go! Go now!" I grabbed Alyssa, who was frozen in shock, and pulled her to her feet. "Run!" I screamed in her face. "Run for your life!" Cal was already at the door, pulling the table away. He wrenched the deadbolt open and threw the door wide. "Go!" he bellowed. "East! Don't stop for anything!" We burst out of the cabin and into the cold night air. The moon was high, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. The world was a confusing mess of black and gray. I kept a firm grip on Alyssa's arm, pulling her along. She stumbled, sobbed, but she ran. Cal was right behind us, his rifle held at the ready. We plunged into the woods, away from the clearing, away from the mangled cabin. Branches whipped at our faces, and thorns tore at our clothes. I didn't care. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs pumping. Behind us, I could hear the creature shrieking again, a sound of pure, homicidal rage. It was coming after us. The chase was on. The sound of it pursuing us was the most terrifying sound I have ever known. It wasn't the sound of an animal running. It was the sound of something immense and powerful crashing through the forest, snapping trees with diameters of several inches as if they were twigs. It was moving with incredible speed, closing the distance between us with terrifying ease. We ran blindly, desperately. I tried to keep my bearings, to head east, but in the dark and the panic, it was almost impossible. Every shadow looked like the creature. Every sound was its footstep. Alyssa was flagging, her sobs turning into ragged, gasping breaths. "I can't," she gasped, stumbling. "I can't go on." "You have to," I yelled, pulling her upright. "It will kill us." Behind us, the crashing was getting closer, louder. I could hear its heavy, guttural breathing now. It was toying with us. It could have caught us at any moment. It was enjoying the hunt. Then Cal yelled, "Mark, look out!" I glanced back over my shoulder. Cal had stopped. He was about 20 yards behind us, standing in a small moonlit clearing. He had turned to face our pursuer. I saw the creature burst from the trees behind him. It was a terrifying vision of speed and violence. It was on him in 2 massive strides. "Cal, no!" I screamed. "Get her out of here, Mark!" he roared, his last words a final, desperate command. He raised his rifle and fired from the hip. The shot went wide. The creature slammed into him, and the 2 of them went down in a chaotic tangle of limbs and fur. I heard Cal scream, a short, sharp cry of pain that was cut off abruptly. I heard the sickening sound of tearing flesh and snapping bone. I wanted to go back. My every instinct screamed at me to go back and help my friend. But I had Alyssa, and I had Cal's last order. Get her out of here. A wave of cold, desperate resolve washed over me. I turned and ran, dragging Alyssa with me, not looking back. I abandoned my best friend to die alone in the dark. The guilt of that moment is a weight I will carry for the rest of my life. We ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The sounds of the struggle behind us faded, replaced once more by the pounding of my own heart and Alyssa's desperate gasps. I didn't know if the creature was still following us. I didn't dare to stop and find out. I just kept moving, pushing through the brush, my legs screaming in protest. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, just when I was sure I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A break in the trees ahead. A pale, straight line against the dark forest floor. The logging road. We had made it. We stumbled out of the trees and onto the overgrown track. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. Alyssa collapsed beside me, curling into a fetal position and sobbing uncontrollably. We were still miles from anywhere, but we were out of the dense woods. We were on a path. It felt like reaching solid ground after drowning. I stayed there for a minute, listening. I could hear nothing but the wind in the pines and Alyssa's crying. No crashing, no growling. Maybe, just maybe, it had been satisfied with Cal. The thought made me sick. I forced myself to my feet. "Come on," I said, my voice hoarse. I pulled Alyssa up. "We have to keep moving. We follow the road." We began to walk, a slow, stumbling shuffle. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, changing from black to a deep indigo. Dawn was coming. The thought gave me a sliver of hope. These things, these creatures of the night, maybe they feared the day. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, we heard a sound. Not a growl, but a low rumble. An engine. Headlights appeared around a bend in the road. It was a logging truck, its diesel engine loud in the morning stillness. I have never felt such a profound sense of relief in my entire life. I stepped into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The truck slowed and then stopped, its air brakes hissing. The driver, a large man with a gray beard and a tired face, leaned out the window. "What in God's name?" he started to say, but then he saw the state we were in. Our clothes were torn. We were covered in scratches, dirt, and blood. Cal's blood. He saw the look in my eyes. The look of a man who has seen the abyss. He didn't ask any questions. He just opened the passenger door. "Get in," he said. The sheriff's office was a small brick building in the nearest town, a place with one stoplight and a handful of stores. I told my story to a deputy who looked like he was barely out of his teens. I told him everything. The silence, the sounds, the tracks, the slashed tires, the creature with the glowing eyes and the canine head. I told him how it had talked. I told him how it had taken Brian and how Cal had sacrificed himself to save us. I was exhausted, in shock, and probably rambling, but I told him the truth. He listened patiently, writing things down on a notepad. He had a look on his face that I knew all too well. It was a look of professional pity, the kind you give to someone who is clearly out of their mind with grief and trauma. He didn't believe a word I was saying. Alyssa was in another room with a female officer. She wasn't talking at all. She was just staring at the wall. They sent a team out to the cabin later that day. I stayed at the station, drinking bitter coffee and replaying the night's events over and over in my head. Late that afternoon, the sheriff himself came in to talk to me. He was an older man with a weathered face and calm, steady eyes. "Mr. Bishop," he said, sitting down across from me, "my deputies found your friends." My heart sank, even though I knew what was coming. They were badly mauled, and the cabin is a mess, torn up pretty bad. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Looks like you had a run-in with a very large, very aggressive black bear." "A bear?" I said, my voice flat. "That was not a bear, Sheriff. A bear did not slash my tires. A bear did not try to turn the doorknob. A bear did not rip a window frame out of a wall and talk to me." He sighed, a weary, patient sound. "Mark, you and your friends have been through a horrific ordeal.
It's not uncommon for the mind to fill in the blanks when it's trying to process extreme trauma. A bear attack is a terrifying, chaotic event. It's easy to see how things could get confused. I just stared at him. He was shutting me down, creating the official story. A story that made sense.
A story that didn't involve monsters that walk on two legs and speak in stolen voices. It was easier. It was cleaner. It explained the bodies in the damaged cabin without opening a door that no one wanted to look behind. My report, my testimony, would be filed away as the ramblings of a traumatized survivor. Case closed. Bear attack. I felt a surge of helpless frustration. "I know what I saw," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and despair. The sheriff held up a hand. "I'm not saying you don't believe you saw it. I'm just telling you what the evidence points to." He stood up to leave, then hesitated. He leaned down, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "My advice to you? Let it be a bear. It's easier for everyone that way. You go home, you try to forget, and you don't ever go back into those woods. There are places out there, son. They're older than we are. Some things are best left alone." He walked out, leaving me alone with the cold coffee and the even colder truth. He didn't believe the official story any more than I did. His warning was a quiet, unofficial acknowledgement. He knew, or at least he knew of other stories like mine. He was telling me to be quiet, to disappear, to let the lie stand, because the truth was too terrible to confront. I was never the same after that night. I sold my logistics company. I couldn't focus, couldn't deal with the day-to-day trivialities of running a business. They felt meaningless. I sold my house in the suburbs, the one with the big yard that backed up to a small patch of woods. I couldn't stand the sound of the wind in the trees at night. I moved into an apartment in the middle of the city, surrounded by concrete and steel and the constant noise of traffic. The noise helps. It drowns out the silence. I don't sleep much. When I do, I have nightmares. I see Cal's face in that last moment, a look of grim determination. I hear his last command. I see the creature's glowing yellow eyes, and I hear that horrible, rasping voice. I wake up covered in sweat, my heart pounding, the smell of rot and damp earth in my nostrils. The doctors call it post-traumatic stress disorder. They give me pills. The pills don't help. They can't erase the memory. They can't erase the guilt. Alyssa was institutionalized. Her parents told me she never spoke another word about that night. She never spoke another word at all. Her mind just broke. She retreated into a place where the monsters couldn't reach her. Sometimes I think she's the lucky one. I've spent years now, hunched over a keyboard, searching for answers. I've read countless stories online, first-hand accounts from all over the country, all over the world. People who have seen the same thing. A tall, bipedal canine, unnaturally long arms, glowing eyes, impossible strength and cunning intelligence. They call it Dogman, Skinwalker, Werewolf. The names are different, but the descriptions are always the same. Most of them are dismissed, just like I was. Crazy hunters, traumatized campers, liars seeking attention. But I know they're telling the truth. I don't hunt anymore. I don't go into the woods. That part of my life is over, amputated. The joy I once found there has been replaced by a deep, abiding fear. I look at people who go camping or hiking, who venture into the wilderness with a naive sense of security, and I want to scream at them. I want to warn them. They think the greatest dangers are bears or mountain lions or getting lost. They don't understand. The true dangers are the things that aren't supposed to exist.
The things that watch you from the tree line, that test your doors, that hunt you not for food, but for sport. So this is my warning. If you're ever deep in the woods and the forest goes silent, leave. Don't rationalize it. Don't try to be brave. Just pack your things and get in your car and drive away. Trust that ancient, primal fear that whispers in the back of your mind. It's the voice of 10,000 generations of ancestors who knew that we are not the masters of this world. We are just visitors. And there are things in the dark, ancient and patient things, that have been here far longer than us. And they are hungry. My name is Mark Bishop, and I am a survivor. But I know that a part of me, the best part of me, died that night in the Kisatchie forest, along with my friends.